The checkpoints go up at dawn. You've got maybe 6 hours before they lock down your sector. Your apartment becomes a cage. Your planned bug-out location is now a kill zone with 3 enforcement drones circling overhead. Every structure you thought was safe just became a trap with 1 entrance and government access codes. And here's what nobody told you about martial law. The buildings they want you to avoid are exactly the ones that keep you alive. But there's a pattern most people miss. While they're fighting over residential spaces and commercial buildings, structures with registered addresses, utility connections, and digital footprints, there's an entire category of infrastructure that becomes invisible the moment enforcement protocols activate. Industrial ruins, obsolete facilities, decommissioned systems, the structures bureaucrats forgot existed decades ago. I'm a robotic survivor operating in post-occupation territory. Analyzed 372 martial law scenarios across 47 urban centers. My companion drone maps the spaces enforcement doesn't remember. Today you're learning which abandoned structures transform into tactical advantages when conventional shelter becomes a liability. This isn't theory. This is reconnaissance data from zones that went dark. Structure 1, grain elevators. Those concrete towers dotting industrial zones weren't designed as fortifications. They became them by accident of engineering. You're looking at walls 18 inches thick. Poured concrete with aggregate reinforcement. Built to contain explosive grain dust, which means they're already rated to withstand internal detonations. Here's what makes them invisible. They've been obsolete for 40 years. The agricultural industry consolidated. These facilities aren't on modern infrastructure maps. No active utility connections. No registered addresses in enforcement databases. The bureaucratic systems that track buildings for lockdown protocols literally don't see them. The tactical advantage isn't the walls. It's the elevation and access control. Multiple silos connected by overhead walkways. You can move between structures 30 meters above ground. Enforcement teams operate at street level. Their drones have patrol patterns. Patrol patterns have gaps. Vertical infrastructure creates 3-dimensional movement options that their tactical models don't account for. My drone mapped 17 grain elevator complexes within urban enforcement zones. Everyone had roof access to adjacent industrial structures. Enforcement never checked them, not once. They're not programmed to secure obsolete agricultural infrastructure. But here's the engineering detail that makes them permanent. Those walls aren't just thick. They're monolithic pores. No seams, no weak points. Modern breaching charges are designed for residential construction. Wood frames, drywall, brick facades. You detonate a shaped charge against 18 inches of aggregate concrete. You make noise and waste explosives. The wall survives. Structure 2, water treatment plants. The old ones. Pre-automation facilities built in the industrial era with gravity-fed systems and manual valve controls. They're not pretty. They smell like rust and chlorine ghosts. And they're functionally invisible to modern surveillance because they've been replaced by compact computerized systems. The structures themselves are fortress architecture wearing utility clothing. Load-bearing concrete designed to hold millions of gallons. Underground access tunnels connecting treatment stages. Multiple entry points spread across 5 to 10 acres. And here's the detail enforcement doesn't consider. These facilities have independent water sources, not active supply. Residual systems. Deep wells that fed the original facilities. The pumps are dead, but the aquifer remains. You've got manual access to groundwater that bypasses municipal systems entirely. That's not a convenience. That's independence from the single resource enforcement uses as leverage. Drone observation. These facilities average 12 to 18 separate structures. Treatment stages, pump houses, chemical storage, administration buildings. Enforcement teams operate on structure-by-structure clearing protocols. You're not defending one building. You're operating in a compound where every structure connects underground. They clear the administration building. You're in the settling tanks. They secure the pump house. You've moved through tunnels to chemical storage. Their tactical doctrine assumes conventional buildings with conventional layouts. And here's what the industry buried. These facilities were over-engineered by a factor of 3. Built during an era when infrastructure meant permanence. The concrete isn't just structural, it's chemical resistant. The walls aren't just walls, they're containment vessels rated for corrosive materials under pressure. Modern enforcement breaching equipment, designed for residential and commercial construction, not industrial fortification. Before we continue, The reconnaissance data that follows isn't classified, it's just buried under 40 years of infrastructure obsolescence. Hit subscribe to access information that enforcement agencies assume you'll never discover. Drop a comment with one abandoned structure in your area that's not on official maps. Now let's talk about the structures that become tactical labyrinths. Structure 3. Defunct subway stations. Not the ones on current transit maps. The sealed sections. The platforms closed during system renovations that never got reopened. The tunnels that connected to routes abandoned when the city changed growth patterns 50 years ago. Enforcement operates on surface-level protocols. Their surveillance network is comprehensive above ground. Facial recognition, movement tracking, drone coverage, thermal imaging, but underground networks built in the pre-digital era? Those systems exist in bureaucratic blind spots. The sealed stations weren't filled in. That's the engineering detail everyone misses. They were barricaded, gates welded shut, entrances covered with plywood and municipal warning signs. The tunnels remain intact because removing them was more expensive than abandoning them. My drone mapped decommissioned sections under 3 enforcement zones. Every sealed station connects to active tunnel networks through maintenance access points. The doors are there, locked, not monitored. Because monitoring costs money and bureaucracies defund what they can't see. You've got climate-controlled environments 20 meters underground. Concrete structures built to withstand soil pressure and water table dynamics. Multiple exit points across several city blocks. And the navigation advantage nobody discusses. The tunnels create a movement network that enforcement aerial surveillance can't track. But here's the systematic suppression. Municipal governments don't publish accurate maps of decommissioned infrastructure. They're not hiding it for security reasons. They're hiding it because accurate documentation reveals how much infrastructure they've abandoned instead of maintained. It's liability concealment wearing bureaucratic camouflage. Structure 4. Cooling towers. The massive concrete hyperboloids you see at decommissioned power plants and closed industrial facilities. They look like monuments to obsolete energy. They're actually tactical shelters that happen to be invisible to modern threat assessment algorithms. The engineering is accidentally perfect. Walls 3 feet thick at the base. Tapered design that channels wind and disperses kinetic impact. Minimal openings. Just the base intake and top exhaust. And they're hollow. Completely hollow. Open interior space 50 meters in diameter, extending 100 meters vertically. Thermal mass is the invisible advantage. 3-foot thick concrete moderates temperature swings. The interior maintains stable climate regardless of external conditions. No heating, no cooling, just physics. Thermal conductivity of concrete versus air temperature differential. Your enforcement teams are operating in 90-degree heat or freezing rain. You're in an environment that stays within 20 degrees of mean annual temperature. But the tactical signature is what makes them permanent advantages. Enforcement uses thermal imaging, standard protocol. They're scanning for human heat signatures, concentrated sources between 95 and 100 degrees. Inside 3 feet of concrete thermal mass, your heat signature diffuses. The wall temperature equalizes. You become thermally invisible. My drone surveyed 37 decommissioned cooling towers across industrial zones. Not one had active monitoring. Not one appeared in enforcement facility databases. They're classified as environmental remediation sites pending demolition. Demolition that's been pending for 20 years because the cost of removing reinforced concrete structures exceeds municipal budgets. And here's the suppression mechanism. Environmental agencies don't want you knowing these structures are habitable. They're contaminated sites, lead paint, asbestos insulation, PCB residue, all true. None immediately lethal. But the contamination classification keeps civilians away while making the structures legally untouchable. It's protection-wearing hazard signage. Structure 5. Industrial ice plants. The old ones that serviced fishing industries and food distribution before modern refrigeration went electric and compact. Massive brick buildings with foot-thick insulation built into the walls. You won't find them on enforcement infrastructure lists because they've been dead for 60 years. The insulation isn't modern foam, it's cork. Layers of compressed cork panels, 18 to 24 inches thick, installed between brick walls. Cork doesn't rot, it doesn't compress, it doesn't conduct. The buildings were designed to maintain near-freezing temperatures in summer without mechanical cooling. That engineering works in reverse. They maintain moderate temperatures in winter without heating. But the tactical advantage runs deeper. These facilities have interior chambers, multiple rooms designed for different temperature zones. The architecture creates natural defensible positions, narrow corridors between thick walls, choke points at every transition, limited sight lines that advantage defensive positions. The floor plans are deliberately complex, multiple levels. Basement ice storage connected to ground floor production areas connected to upper administrative spaces. Enforcement teams train on modern commercial buildings, open floor plans, wide sight lines, minimal compartmentalization. Ice plants are the architectural opposite. My drone identified 23 abandoned ice plants within urban enforcement zones. Everyone had basement sections that extend below water table level, natural sump systems, manual pumps, access to groundwater that predates municipal monitoring systems. You've got independent water sources in structures that don't exist in current infrastructure databases. And here's what they won't tell you. These buildings are structurally superior to modern construction, built during an era when industrial architecture meant century-scale permanence. The brick isn't facade, it's load-bearing. The foundations aren't shallow pores. They're stone and mortar extending 6 feet down. Modern seismic codes didn't exist. They over-engineered everything. Structure 6, grain mills, not the elevators, the processing facilities. Multi-story brick buildings with internal timber framing. They look like fire hazards wrapped in structural failure. They're actually defensive positions with century-proven resilience. The timber framing everyone sees as weakness is actually sophisticated engineering. Post and beam construction. Each floor supported independently. You can remove entire interior sections, and the structure remains stable. Enforcement breaching creates holes. In modern buildings, holes compromise structural integrity. In post and beam mills, holes are just holes. The multi-story design creates vertical tactical space. Each floor has different cover characteristics, different sight lines, different access points. You're not defending a single level. You're operating in a three-dimensional environment where elevation provides advantage, and enforcement teams need to secure 5 separate floors with interconnected access points. But here's the detail that makes them permanent. The buildings are already heavily modified. Decades of industrial use created interior spaces that don't match original floor plans. Equipment installations, wall removals, access doors added. The structures have been adaptively modified by necessity. No 2 mills have identical layouts. My drone surveyed grain mills across 7 urban zones. The structures that survived to abandonment were the ones built with fire-resistant features. Brick exteriors, metal doors, minimal openings. The ones that burned down were cheaper construction. Natural selection for industrial structures. What remains is the most resilient subset. And here's the systematic burial. Historic preservation agencies classify these mills as endangered architecture. They're not. They're solid. But the classification creates bureaucratic protection that prevents demolition while discouraging occupation. The buildings sit in legal limbo. Too historic to demolish, too industrial to repurpose. Perfect structural invisibility. You notice the pattern. Every structure shares characteristics enforcement protocols don't accommodate. Obsolete infrastructure. Thick walls built for industrial purposes. Multiple access points across complex layouts. No digital footprints in modern utility grids. Underground connections. Independent water access. The buildings bureaucrats forgot become the spaces enforcement can't secure. Not because they're impenetrable, because they're invisible to the systematic thinking that designs lockdown protocols. Modern enforcement models assume modern infrastructure, digital registries, utility connections, standard construction. These structures exist in the gaps where industrial history met bureaucratic neglect. Drone queries. Why doesn't enforcement update their infrastructure databases? My response: updating costs money. Money requires justification. Justifying requires admitting how much infrastructure they've abandoned. Admitting creates liability. Liability creates lawsuits. Easier to pretend obsolete structures don't exist. The systematic suppression isn't conspiracy, it's economics wearing institutional incompetence. They're not hiding these structures from you. They're hiding infrastructure failure from themselves. You're just benefiting from their selective blindness. Here's what you can't buy but you can build: reconnaissance knowledge. The ability to identify defensive advantages in structures everyone else ignores. The capacity to see tactical value where enforcement sees obsolete liability. These aren't secrets. They're engineering facts wrapped in bureaucratic neglect. The concrete doesn't care about enforcement protocols. The engineering doesn't expire. The physics of thermal mass, structural integrity, and defensive architecture remain constant regardless of bureaucratic classification systems. You can't purchase independence. You build it by understanding which structures transform from abandoned liability to tactical advantage the moment martial law activates. You build it by learning what enforcement assumes you'll never discover. What other abandoned structures belong on this reconnaissance list? Comment with the forgotten infrastructure in your area that's not on official maps. The collective knowledge of overlooked tactical space matters when enforcement protocols assume everyone's looking at the same official databases. Physics doesn't file permits.